As we've noted, the Rohingya have long faced discrimination and persecution. In human rights terms, they are often described as a forgotten people. Azeem Ibrahim is a scholar, though, who has documented their history. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Global Policy and a research professor at the U.S. Army War College. He's also the author of the book, The Rohingyas, Inside Myanmar's Forgotten Genocide. He joined me from Chicago. Mr. Ibrahim, first tell me, the history of the Rohingya in this region dates back centuries. Why are they so persecuted?
Well, the Rohingya have faced wave after wave of violence over the last half century. The most recent wave, which we've seen just start a few weeks ago, is probably the worst that they've experienced. The history of the Rohingya persecution goes back to the Second World War, when the Japanese invaded what was at that time British Burma. The majority Buddhist population sided with the Japanese invaders, believing that they would be victorious and this would lead to swifter independence, whereas the minority Rohingya population stayed loyal to the British colonial masters. So after the country did become independent, there was bad blood between the two people. But despite that, there was relative calm between the minorities up until 1962, when there was a military coup by General Ne Win, and he tried to implement a communist manifesto, what he called the Burmese Road to Socialism. And this was an economic disaster. So he did what a lot of dictators do in that situation, is that he tried to find a scapegoat, and the minority of choice, who were already seen with suspicion, the Rohingya were selected to bear the brunt. And he passed a number of laws throughout the year trying to disenfranchise the Rohingya, including the 1982 Citizenship Act, which stripped them of all their nationality. He also became much more of a militant Buddhist, saying that only Buddhists can be loyal citizens to this country and all other minorities are disloyal. So the Rohingya minority, who were the largest of all the different ethnic minorities, were selected and alienated, and they've been persecuted ever since.
And they're predominantly Muslim?
They're predominantly Muslim, but it has to be noted that there are a lot of other religions amongst them. For example, recent news reports that I've come across say that over 500 families, Rohingya families, have now been expelled as well. 500 Rohingya Hindu families have also been expelled as well. So they have the different religions, religious minorities amongst them.
You mentioned this sort of most recent spark at the end of August that sparked this most recent terror, and it was an attack by the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army on a police outpost. What should we make of this Salvation Army, as they call themselves?
Yeah. Well, this is a relatively new organisation. It's relatively little known with very little resources. And on the 25th of August, they attacked a number of security officials that left about a dozen of them dead. The military reacted overwhelmingly and disproportionately. But I actually wrote many pieces over the last year, some of them going back last year, in December last year, saying that the military is actually preparing for this massive offensive to ethnically cleanse the Rohingya. And I believe that the most recent attack was simply a trigger, as an excuse for the military to then go in and then try to ethnically cleanse all these villages of the Rohingya. In fact, General Min Aung Hlaing, the Commander-in-Chief of the Myanmar Armed Forces, said on his Facebook page about 2 weeks ago that what they're doing is unfinished business from 1942 to remove these illegal Bengalis from their country.
So let's put Aung San Suu Kyi into this picture now. You've described her, as others have, as an icon and a symbol of sort of Western democratic values. You sort of think, well, perhaps, this is not the woman we thought she was, but you've argued, in fact, that she has not changed. Tell me why.
Yeah, well, Aung San Suu Kyi has simply made a political calculation. She has evolved from a peace campaigner to a full-time politician, and she's made a political calculation that the Rohingya issue is simply not worth utilising any political capital over. It is not worth alienating the military or alienating the extreme Buddhist clergy. And she's actually gone much further than that. A number of people I've spoken to, and I published a piece on this in Newsweek just a few days ago, a number of people I've spoken to who have known her for many decades. Some of them campaigned for her, some of them set up, worked for her in very intimate settings. They believe that Aung San Suu Kyi has not changed. She actually believes what the military is doing. She's a Burma Buddhist. She shares the same kind of Burma Buddhist views as the military, and she's quietly supporting what the military is actually doing. And this was evident in her speech just a few days ago, in which she gave to the international audience, in which she claims in which she made numerous very bizarre kind of claims, claiming such as that there's no operations going on, despite the fact that we can see houses being burnt down, and she doesn't understand why the Rohingya are leaving after almost 500,000 have been expelled from their homes. So she's become a shield standing for the military and protecting the military during this very, very difficult time.
What do you think the implications are for this within Myanmar itself?
Well, this is extremely damaging to the reputation of Myanmar, that we all believed and hoped that it was emerging from a military dictatorship to democracy, and this icon of democracy would lead this country, you know, onto new pastures. But her behaviour has been very, very disappointing. The fact is that Aung San Suu Kyi and many of the elite in Burma see it as a Buddhist country that has these ethnic minorities rather than a multi-ethnic country. And now they're simply trying to purify what they believe, purify the country and remove all these ethnic minorities. And the Rohingya minority is the largest one that they're starting off with.
I mean, essentially, you know, Western nations have talked about helping, offering humanitarian aid. There's some talk at the United Nations about safe zones. What could Western countries like Canada, for example, or the US actually do to, I guess, influence change or do something to help the Rohingya?
Yeah. Well, there has to be much more pressure put on Myanmar itself. In March of this year, the United Nations passed a resolution asking for a full-scale human rights commission inquiry into the atrocities in Myanmar. And Aung San Suu Kyi herself, who's actually the foreign minister of Myanmar, said that she will not issue visas to any of those investigators, and she simply didn't let them into the country. In her speech, you know, just a few days ago, she said that you know, she welcomes anybody to come to Myanmar, but again today they said that they will not permit the UN to enter into the country. So the first thing the United Nations and the international community needs to do is to have some sort of sanction and penalty on Myanmar for committing these kinds of atrocities, and then not permitting the UN to actually come and investigate. They're just flouting international law, and there's very little pressure on them to actually change course as it stands.
I was going to say, it seems like a very hopeless situation for the Rohingya.
It does seem like very hopeless, you know, and this is despite the fact that, you know, Aung San Suu Kyi, once again, she said that they will all be permitted to return. I'm not sure what exactly they'll be returning to. All their houses and villages have been burnt to the ground. And in fact, just today I was reading some reports that the military has not only burnt down the houses, but they go back to the same villages to make sure that if they missed any houses, or if they've not been completely burnt down, that they make sure that they're completely destroyed. So these people aren't going back to anything at all. And the conditions that the Myanmar military, the Myanmar authorities actually put on the Rohingya to return are so absurd that they just cannot be achieved. You know, they want the Rohingya to provide paperwork for where they cross the border into Bangladesh, including paperwork from the Bangladeshi authorities. And obviously such paperwork doesn't exist. And then they want them to prove which villages they came from, showing their ID cards, etc. And these people literally fled with nothing at all whilst they were being killed and whilst they were being persecuted. So to meet those kind of criteria, it's just it just seems quite absurd.
Azeem Ibrahim, thank you very much for your insight and your expertise on this.
Thank you for having me.